Hello, and welcome back to the Read Aloud of the BFG. Last time we met, we read the first 3 chapters. It was The Witching Hour, The Who, and The Snatch. In the last chapter, The Snatch, our main character, Sophie, had been snatched out of her bed during the witching hour in the middle of the night. By who? A tall, very tall, dark figure that looked like a human. So now we're going to kind of learn, hopefully, what happens to Sophie in the next chapter, titled The Cave. And if you'll notice, we have him running with Sophie in that blanket. The giant ran on and on, but now a curious change took place in his way of running. He seemed to suddenly go into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was traveling at such a speed that the landscape became blurred. The wind stung Sophie's cheeks. It made her eyes water. It whipped her head back and rustled her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation that they were flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or over sea. The giant had some sort of magic legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong that she had to duck down again into the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. It was really possible that they were crossing oceans. Could that be possible? It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on for what seemed like hours. Then, all at once, the wind stopped its howling, and the pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head out of the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally, although normal was a silly word to use when describing a galloping giant. He leaped over dozens of rivers. He went rattling through great forests, then down into a valley and up over a range of hills as bare as concrete. And soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. The ground was flat and pale and yellow, and great lumps of blue rock were scattered around. Sounds different. And dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. Sophie, still peering out from the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her great craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it the sky was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying among delicate, frosty white flakes of clouds, and over to one side of the rim of the morning sun was coming up as red as blood. Right beneath the mountain, the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His great big chest was heaving in and out, and he paused to catch his breath. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was as big as a house. And the giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as if it had been a football. And now, where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large that the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. He strode into a black hole carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet, and a suitcase in another. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place so that the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden from the outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside this cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground, and then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away, and Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. He's getting ready to eat me, she told herself. He will probably eat me raw, just as I am. Or perhaps he'll boil me first. Or will he have me fried? He will drop me like a piece of bacon into some gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat. A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place, and Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cavern with high rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves stood row upon row of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in corners, and they filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of a floor, there was a table that was 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw under the cloak he was wearing sort of a collarless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too short for his legs. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her night-tie, gazed back at him through the thick, steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and the finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What have us got here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. The next chapter, the BFG, that would be chapter 5. Giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. "Now, he is really going to eat me," Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as a wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing his massive square teeth. The teeth were very white, very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man gobbling canny bull?" he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all canny bully and murderful. And they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there us has the famous bone-crunching giant. The bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 wopsy whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-bursting. Noise of crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles around." "Ouch," Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giants only gobbles human beings from turkey," the giant said. "Every night, Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?" "Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasting ever so much juicier and more scrumdiddlyumptious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beans has a glamorous flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey." "I suppose they would," Sophie said. "Of course they would," the giant shouted. "Every human being is diddly and different, and some scrumdiddlyumptious, and some is ucky slush. Greek is full of ucky slush. No giant is eating Greeks ever." "Why not?" asked Sophie. "Greeks from Greece is tasting greasy," the giant said. "I imagine that's impossible." "Or that's possible too," Sophie said. She was wondering with a bit of a tremble what all this talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. "As I am saying," the giant went on, "all human beings is having different flavors. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats." "Why hats?" said Sophie. "You is not very clever," the giant said, moving his ears in and out. "I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bungalow." "Do you like vegetables?" Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation. Here is a picture of him looking at Sophie on the table. Notice how tiny she is compared to him. The conversation went towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food when they talked about vegetables. "You was trying to change the subject," the giant said sternly. "We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of human bean. The human bean is not a vegetable." "Oh, but the bean is a vegetable," Sophie said. "Not the human bean," the giant said. "The human bean has 2 legs, and a vegetable has no legs at all." Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was make the giant cross. "The human bean," the giant went on, "is coming in billions of different flavors. For instance, human beans from Wales is tasting very whooshy of fish. There is something very fishy about Wales." "You mean whales?" Sophie said. "Wales is something quite different." "Wales is Wales," the giant said. "Don't gobble funk around with words. I will give you another example. Human beans from Jersey has most disgustable woolly tickle on the tongue," the giant said. "Human beans from Jersey is tasting of cardigans." "You mean jerseys?" Sophie said. "You are once again gobble funking," the giant shouted. "Don't do it. This is a serious and snitching subject. May I continue?" Please do," Sophie said. "Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs," and the giant went on. "Of course," Sophie said. "They taste of Great Danes." "Wrong," cried the giant, slapping his thigh. "Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors." "Then what did the people of Labrador taste of?" Sophie asked. "Danes," the giant cried triumphantly. "Danes! Great Danes!" "Aren't you getting a bit mixed up?" Sophie said. "I is a very mixed up giant," the giant said. "But I does do my best. And I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper." And this is him again, having conversation. He looks kind of friendly, if you'll notice. He has a little bit of a smirk on his face. "Wellington," Sophie said. "Where is Wellington?" "Your head is full of squash flies," the giant said. "Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington had an especially scrumdiddlyumptious taste. So says the welly-eating giant." "What did the people of Wellington taste of?" Sophie asked. "Boots," the giant said. "Of course," Sophie said. "I should have known." Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done right away than be kept hanging around any longer. "What sort of human beings do you eat?" she asked, trembling. "Me?" shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on their shelves. "Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes. All the others is gobbling them up every night, but not me. I is a freaky giant. I is a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the BFG, the big friendly giant." "What is your name?" "My name is Sophie," Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news she just heard. What good news that is. She's not going to be eaten. However, he did bring her to giant country, so that's kind of scary. All right, we're moving on to chapter 6, titled The Giants. "But if you were so nice and friendly," Sophie said, "then why did you snatch me from my bed and run away with me?" "Because you saw me," the big friendly giant answered. "If anyone is ever seeing a giant, he or she must be taking away hip switch." "Why?" asked Sophie. "Well, first of all," said the BFG, "human beings is not really believing in giants, is they?" "Human beings is not thinking we exist." "I do," Sophie said. "Ah, but that is only because you have seen me," cried the BFG. "I cannot possibly allow anyone, even little girls, to be seeing me and staying home. The first thing you'll be doing, you'll be spreading around, yodeling the news that you were actually seeing a giant, and then a great giant hunt, a mighty giant look-see would be starting up all over the world, with human beings all rummaging for the great giant you saw, getting wildly excited. People will be come rushing and bushing after me with goodness knows what, and they could be catching me and locking me in a cage to be stared at. They would be putting me into the zoo or a bunkum house with all of those squiggling hippo dumplings and crocodile-dillies. Sophie knew the giant, what he was saying was true, and if any person reported actually have seen a giant haunting the streets of a town at night, there would most certainly be a horrific hullabaloo across the world. I will bet you, the BFG went on, that you would have been splashing the news all over the wonky world, wouldn't you, if I hadn't wiggled you away? I suppose I would, Sophie said. And that would never do, said the BFG. So what will happen to me now? Sophie asked. If you do go back, you will be telling the world, said the BFG, most likely on the telly, bunkum box, and the radio squeaker. So you will just have to be staying here with me for the rest of your life. Oh, no, cried Sophie. Oh, yes, said the BFG. I am warning you not ever to go whiffling about this cave without I is with you, or you will be coming to an ucky-mucky end. I is showing you now who is going to eat you up if they is ever catching even one tiny little glimpse of you. The big friendly giant picked Sophie up off the table and carried her to the cave entrance. He rolled the huge stone to one side and said, Peep out over there, little girl, and tell me what you are seeing. Sophie, sitting on the BFG's hand, peeped out of the cave. The sun was up and shining fiery hot over the great yellow wasteland with its blue rocks and dead trees. Is you seeing them? The BFG asked. Sophie, squinting through the glare of the sun, saw several tremendous tall figures moving among the rocks. There's kind of what she sees. About 500 yards away, 3 or 4 others were sitting quite motionless on the rocks themselves. This is giant country, the BFG said. Those is all giants, every one. It was a brain-boggling sight. The giants were all naked except for a sort of short skirt around their waist, and their skin were burnt brown by the sun. But it was their sheer size of each one of them that boggled Sophie's brain most of all. They were simply colossal, far taller and wider than the big friendly giant upon whose hand she was sitting. And oh, how ugly they were. Many of them had large bellies. All of them had long arms and big feet. They were too far away for their faces to be seen clearly, and perhaps that was a good thing. What on earth are they doing? Sophie asked. Nothing, said the BFG. They're just moochling and foochling around and waiting for the night to come. Then they will all be galloping off to places where people is living to find their suppers. You mean to Turkey? Sophie said. Bone-crunching giant will be galloping off to Turkey. Of course, said the BFG, but the others will be whiffling off to all sorts of flung-away places like Wellington for booty flavor and Panama for the hattie taste. Every giant is having his own favorite hunting ground. Do they ever go to England? Sophie asked. Often, said the BFG. They say the English is tasting ever so wonderfully of crod scallop. I'm not sure I quite know what that means, Sophie said. Meanings is not important, said the BFG. I cannot be right all the time. Quite often I is left inside of right. And are those all beastly giants over there really going off tonight to eat people? Sophie asked. All of them is guzzling human beings every night, the BFG answered. All of them except me. That is why you will be coming to an ucky-mucky end if any of them should ever be getting their gloggers upon you. You will be swallowed up like a piece of frumpkin pie, all in one dollop. But eating people is horrible, Sophie cried. It's frightful. Why doesn't someone stop them? And who, please, is going to be stopping them? Asked the BFG. Couldn't you? Said Sophie. Never in a pig's whistle, cried the BFG. All of those man-eating giants is enormous and very fierce. They is all at least 2 times my wideness and double my royal highness. Twice as high as you, cried Sophie. Easily that, said the BFG. You was seeing them in the distance. But you just wait till you see them up close. Those giants is all at least 50 feet tall with huge muscles and cockles alive. Oh, I is the titchy one. I is the runt. 24 feet is puddle nuts in giant country. You mustn't feel bad about it, Sophie said. I think you're just great. Why, even your toes must be as big as sausages. Bigger, said the BFG, looking pleased. They is big as bumble hammers. How many giants are out there? Sophie asked. 9 altogether, answered the BFG. That means, said Sophie, that somewhere in the world, every single night, 9 wretched people get carried away and eaten alive? More, said the BFG. It is all depending, you see, on how big the human beings is. Japanese beans is very small, so a giant will need to gobble up about 6 Japanese people before he is feeling full up. Others, like Norway people and Yankee Doodles, is ever so much bigger, and usually 2 or 3 of those makes a good tuck-in. But did those disgusting giants go to every single country in the world? Sophie asked. All countries excepting Greece is getting visited sometime or another, the BFG answered. The country which a giant visits is depending on how he is feeling. If he is very warm weather, a giant is feeling as hot as a sizzle pan. He'll probably go galloping off far Frisbury North to get himself an Eskimo or 2 to cool him down. A nice fat Eskimo to a giant is like a lovely ice cream lolly to you. I'll take your word for it, Sophie said. And then again, if it's a frosty night and the giant is fridging with cold, he'll probably point his nose towards the sweltering hotlands to guzzle a few Hottentots to warm him up. How perfectly horrible, Sophie said. Nothing hots up a cold giant like a hot Hottentot, the BFG said. And if you were going to put me down on the ground and I was to walk out among them now, Sophie said, would they really eat me up? Like a whip's whittle, cried the BFG. And what is more, you're so small they wouldn't even have to chew you. The first one to be seeing you would pick you up with his fingers and down you'd go like a drop of drain water. Let's go back inside, Sophie said. I hate even watching them. All right. Well, those are our 3 chapters for today. So, we found out Sophie's not going to be eaten right now. So that's a good thing. But she has to live forever with the BFG. How would you feel? All right, so let's go ahead and think about that until next time.